Punting on the Thames. Well, really, this is a punt for 2 campers. It could take 4 for a day trip, the boatman said. Still, I suppose you'll be all right. None of you are exactly fat, and your backpacks don't look too heavy. That'll be £14 plus £6 deposit. Take it easy, and if you meet any big boats, turn into their wash so you don't ship any water. Doug, Keith, Ken and myself nodded seriously. We stowed our bags and Doug's guitar at the back of the punt, and the boatman showed us how to start the engine and steer. And if you want to stop quickly for any reason, you just throw her into reverse, he added. See you in a week's time. Enjoy your holiday. We boarded the punt carefully and set off upstream, up the Thames, away from the Abingdon boatyard. I looked back at the boatman. He was watching our progress and still had a slightly concerned look on his face. Rounding the first bend, we saw a figure on the bank, waving to us. It was Fats Dawson, the 5th member of our group. As he clambered aboard with his giant rucksack, the boat sighed and slumped deeper into the water. The punt was about 20 feet long, with the motor at the back. There was a framework of steel rods which slotted into fixings on each side of the boat, and curved pieces of steel which slotted into the uprights. A large piece of canvas was slung over the frame, which was large enough to provide shelter, but it could be tied back to open up the deck, rather like an old-fashioned convertible car. We set off with the punt 3/4 open and stowed our bags on top of the engine, which had a wooden cover. The canvas walls at the back of the boat held our bags in. We motored further upstream, and as the weather worsened, folded more and more of the canvas forward until the craft must have looked like a giant caterpillar. The problem was that the steering gear was at the back of the punt, and rain was blowing in from the front. So we set up a system, a lookout at the front, peering through a small aperture formed by raising the canvas curtain a couple of inches, instructing the steersman whether to go to port or starboard, although none of us was quite sure which was which. Doug was relieved of duties so he could play his guitar, on condition that he didn't play messing about on the river. We found a place to camp, having got permission from the farmer whose land abutted the river, and searched for wood to make a fire. Although the other members of the group were all scouts, the fire was not a great success, as the wood we found was generally pretty damp. The scouts set up their tent, and as I had no lilo to sleep on, I slept on the cushions in the boat, which we moored by tying the rope at one end to a large log and staking the rope at the back with pegs. The following morning I was awakened by shouts. "Bob, Bob, wake up! Quick, look out, look out!" I lifted a piece of the canvas and saw that the boat had moved. The log with the rope around it was now inexplicably in the river. Of the 10 pegs which had held down the other rope, only 1 remained in position, 9 having freed themselves. The punt was angled at about 45 degrees to the bank, straining at the leash and pointing to the nearby waterfall next to the lock. Ken and Keith hauled me in, and we secured the boat again, ready for breakfast. I brought a large pack of cornflakes with me, and I poured them out of my bag, opened up the packet, and munched on a couple of dry ones. As I did so, I saw a swan looking quizzically at me and the cornflakes. "I wonder if swans like cornflakes," I conjectured, and tossed one in the direction of the bird. Swans do like cornflakes. The cornflake was quickly consumed, and the swan swam up to the side of the boat, followed by his spouse and 4 offspring, all of whom liked cornflakes, and who were battling with each other to get the major share of what remained. The less accurate beaks found my fingers, which were foolishly still holding the pack, so I pulled the bag up from the packet and emptied the contents into the Thames. We set off soon afterwards, the weather still being miserable. To carry on upstream, we had to negotiate the lock. We got the punt in using the same teamwork technique as the day before, but somehow the messages from the lookout were not clearly conveyed to the steersman. As a result, the punt skewed round inside the lock. The boat was very slightly less narrow than the lock. As a result, having swung through 90 degrees, the boat was firmly wedged between the walls of the lock. The water started to go down, and as it did so, the boat lurched. Seeing what had happened, the lockkeeper reversed the flow of the water, which started to rise again, the plan being to relaunch our craft. Unfortunately, the boat was jammed so tightly that it stayed fixed between the walls, now in danger of being flooded as the lock waters rose. "Stop the lock!" shouted Fats, which the lockkeeper did. Despite the inclement weather, it was high season and there were plenty of pleasure boats around, some queuing up to get through the lock. We must have featured in quite a lot of holiday snaps as people came up to photograph the boat and us. By this time, we'd managed to crawl out of the boat and lever ourselves up onto the side walls of the lock. We lay on our fronts, hung over the lock walls, and pushed and pulled the punt until we finally freed it, to a considerable round of applause. The lockkeeper was not applauding, however. He charged us treble for the extra time and inconvenience we'd caused him. Towards the end of our trip, Fats Dawson, I never discovered what his real name was, began to get grumpy. "It's not fair," he said. "You've all had a go at steering except me." This was true, and for a good reason. Dawson was the sort of person who could turn the simplest of tasks into a disaster zone. But he kept on, and eventually we relented. Dawson took over the steering, and Ken took on the lookout's duties. Dawson hadn't quite realised that if you want the boat to go right, you move the tiller to the left. As Ken messaged Dawson, the rest of us were blissfully unaware that we were heading for the bank. Suddenly, the canvas shelter was no longer protecting us from the rain. It was hanging from the branches of a tree. Unfortunately, it was the canvas shelter that was holding in our bags, and as the canvas peeled off, 3 of the bags plopped into the river, bobbed up and down for a few seconds, then slowly submerged beneath the surface of the Thames. We also lost an upright and a piece of the curved roof structure. We found alternative names for Fats and Dawson. Okay, my fault, I'll get the stuff," said Dawson, and so saying, stripped down to his underpants and dived into the Thames. He managed to retrieve all the bags, but not the bits of frame. We made camp there, found some wood, lit a fire, and started trying to dry out our clothes, only to be confronted by an irate farmer and his 2 Alsatian dogs. "Who said you could come on my land?" expostulated the farmer, and his dogs accentuated the message, one barking, one snarling. To give the farmer his due, when we'd explained the situation, his anger subsided, to be replaced with not a little mirth. Even the dogs changed their attitude. Before we got back to the boatyard, Doug sewed up the torn canvas, covering as well as he could, while the rest of us went in search of small branches. We selected the best and with the aid of scout knives fashioned an upright and a curve to replace the missing framework. These impromptu pieces were located at the back of the boat by the engine to minimise the chances of their being seen by the boatmen when we returned to Abingdon. We all agreed that if we lost our deposit, Dawson should compensate us. Except Dawson, who got out of the boat with his tote bag before we went around the final bend. The boatman looked quite relieved to see his boat again, and Dawson did not have to compensate us.